Russians of Reddit, what is the older generation's opinion on the USSR? Both my parents were born and raised in Kazakhstan. My dad's side fled to Germany sometime before the collapse, but my mum's side only had the opportunity during the collapse. She only recently told me that when everything started going to crap and all of the smaller countries decided they wanted to become independent states, the Russian government basically dropped the shared currency and introduced their new currency from basically one day to the next. When this happened, they had already booked their flights from their town to Moscow and then from Moscow to Germany, with a day layover. They were very much aware that they didn't have any money to spend in Moscow, but luckily the hotel was paid for by the German government. However, this still left them with the transport from the airport to the hotel. She told me that when they got there, none of the taxis would accept the old currency, even though people who were natives there could have taken the money and exchanged it for new currency without much hassle. They finally found a taxi driver who took them to the hotel and accepted their money, but she also said that he was very tense the whole time because apparently most airport taxis back then were controlled by the mob. Mum told me that before the collapse the USSR wasn't so bad if you played your part. Dad's side of the family are, for the most part, still very nostalgic about the good old times when everyone had a stable job and a simpler life. But I also have to mention that my mum lived in a bigger city in the north close to the Russian border, and had thus access to more amenities and more importantly information, while my dad grew up on a farm in a small village in the far south and his family were largely self-sustaining. My mother and I came here from a former Soviet Union state when I was 3. During her prime, she was a high-ranking medical officer, then afterwards she continued to be an OBGYN. She's in her late 60s now, but whenever I ask her how did our family live and what it was like, she always described it positively. For a family of doctors, mother, father, and grandmother were all doctors. We lived in modest high-rise apartment, 3 bedrooms, living room, couple bathrooms, kitchen, along with other tenants who had a wide range of occupations. Everyone in my town went to the same bazaar. We used to play soccer in the parking lot of the apartment building. My grandmother used to tell us stories of how hard it was in the beginning of the Soviet Union and through World War II. When she was around the age of 10, she was forced to work on a cotton farm until the day she passed. She would always avoid them. But she was very fond of Stalin and genuinely supported him because of how peaceful things became after World War II. My mother acknowledges the negative things that he did, but she doesn't disagree of how good of a life she had. Up until the Soviet Union collapses and the states were overrun by corrupt autocrats, there weren't so many complications and difficulties as there are when we moved here. Day-to-day life wasn't as gloomy and shady as everyone likes to describe it in the West. I've lived in the US for most of my life. Life here is good, don't get me wrong, but if I can speak for the older generation of my family, I believe they loved the simplicity, camaraderie and how much people cared for each other rather than compare themselves to others. Born after the fall of the USSR, but both my parents grew up and live in it. My grandmother was in the siege of Leningrad and is still alive. There isn't much I can say, but my grandmother says it was overall a tougher time to live. However, it felt more secure than now, and much more secure than right after the fall. The 90s in Russia were a mess and a half, where there basically was no functioning government or police. My parents themselves say that the 90s were so scary that they wonder if that was better during USSR times. English is not my first language, uses complete sentences, and has a single typo, writes better than most native English speakers on Reddit. I belong to a Siberian ethnic group that faced repression during Stalinist era and after. Plus, a good deal of my family fought against the Soviets during the Civil War. A lot of them died or fled the country. My grandfather grew up in the Gulag and never had a good thing to say about the communists. Like much of the family of his generation, he was branded son of the enemy of the state his whole life and always had difficulties living in the Soviet state. My mother and aunt, on the other hand, grew up when it was much more stable. Food, utilities and entertainment were plentiful. They listened to rock bands, ate ice cream and watched international films. And a lot of their peers joined organizations like Pioneers in the Party, much to disappointment of my grandfather and his peers. However, 90s in Russia were absolutely savage, especially in Siberia. Normal functions broke down, currency was out of flux, people lost pensions, crime was out of control, My grandmother really missed and lamented the olden times in the 90s. Even though it wasn't as free, there was security, certainty and overall hopefulness. My uncle was killed by a reckless driver in the middle of the day and the police essentially refused to investigate. Grandparents' dacha was vandalized and burglarized so many times without any concern from authorities that my mild-mannered university professor grandfather decided to guard it himself with a shotgun and ended up getting one of the guys. My view and that of my family is skewed because of the fact that we're a minority ethnic group in Russia, even though my family has resided in Russia ever since they took over and colonized. Even though I held Russian citizenship, ate bread, went to banya on Sundays, spoke Russian as first language. Native languages were illegal to be taught for a long time. I was never called Russian in Russia, and at times treated rather poorly on that account. Especially when I lived in Moscow, I felt like a foreigner in my own country. I know I'm straying from the original question, but the overall point of this is to illustrate another dimension to the older generation's opinion of USSR prompt. I hope I didn't drivel. I had a friend in college from Russia. One thing I will always remember is that her Russian passport said Yakut, not Russian. She was born and raised in Siberia and was a Korna native. For the record, most interesting Ask Reddit post I've encountered. Thank you. Yeah, I can't stop reading. I am born in USSR in the late 70s. Good way to describe it. It's like a big corporation. It gives you housing, lunches, etc. You work for it. You aren't really supposed to do your own business because you already work for the corporation. If you do something wrong, others are supposed to give you feedback. Everyone says they are super enthused about the corporation's profits, but in reality they really don't. Also, a lot of people steal because who cares? It's some faceless big business. You are not hurting anyone. On the other hand, it's a stable job. You can reasonably expect to work here for the lifetime and advance in your career even if you're really stupid and can't make decisions, as long as you're not annoying the wrong people. In fact, it was a pretty sweet deal for regular people who don't really want to put in too much effort. Just do at least some job, and you're all set. Now, a lot of people are pretty butthurt about USSR, many of them rightly so. My family was like not an elite, but it was a working class family where everyone just did their job. It was a pretty crappy family by today's standards, but it wasn't a bad setting for it. Like, we had free housing, free medicine, free education. Everyone was pretty happy. If only groceries were also free, that would have been just awesome. And it was expected to happen at one point. What really screwed us over is the 90s. Those were freaking horrible. I was born after USSR in a post-Soviet Union country. I'm currently in my later 20s and my country has become quite poor after the breakup. Because my country is really poor now, a lot of young and middle-aged people move out to other countries. Russia includes. So there are many old people and not so much young ones. Older generation miss USSR like nothing else in their life. I bet they would trade their relatives to go back again. One of the problems of USSR is that they provided everything in your life. House, car, vacations and etc. Leaving only money for food and clothes. So you worked all your life. From your salary they give you a house, vacation, medicine and everything else. Your end of the month salary was just for food and other amenities. You could not save up your money, nor did you learn how to save and use it wisely. So after USSR fallen, they couldn't possibly adapt, no savings, no experience of living without anything and on your own. So as the result, they miss it. It's a big problem they are going through their life after USSR. How can you live on your own when 40-50 plus years you were under someone's admission and looking over your life and dictating it for you? Now you are abandoned 50 plus years old baby looking for a way to live. So I was technically born in USSR, but way too late. So on my mother's side of the family people went. Great-grandparents, peasants. Grandparents, qualified laborers. Mother, higher education, worked in R&D. Father's side, grandparents, peasant. Father, Higher education in an emerging field. I remembers the 90x's crawling in the ruins or old factories or visiting complex magnificent factories being basically pulled apart. I remember how parents were not paid for months and how the new company that charged for heat electricity sent bills higher than a single person's salary. My parents lost 10,000 plus Soviet rubles. Remember how my parents argued about Brezhnev versus Khrushchev? They came from different parts of USSR which prospered under different gensecks. Remember how my mother described how crap were 1950x on the Volga and situation was bordering famine. She told me that one of my relatives really hated Stalin and would openly curse him and he was never punished for that. My mother loved to travel. Traveled all across USSR and some parts of Eastern Europe. OHH and boy were logistics in USSR bad. Born and raised in Slovakia. Parents grew up with the regime. It was easy as long as you were the type to shut up, mind your own business, and accept the minimum. Everyone had a roof, even though it often leaked. Nobody was hungry, but good luck getting meat without bribing the butcher. Everyone had a job, some the one they chose, others the one they were forced to do. Nobody was jealous of others because everyone had equally as much. Nothing. There were no hard choices about career, what school to go to, whether the housing market was right to buy now, what credit card was the best, or what benefits to choose. These were not options because there was no variety. Everything was uniform and uniformly substandard. Minimum effort for minimum results. But you were fricked if you had dreams, if you were ambitious. The regime ground you down, imprisoned you and slowly killed you if you dared to ask why or why not this way. If you were different, if you had the wrong background, if your parents happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, if you were one of the unlucky, it was life of imprisonment, persecution, and violence. Take an upvote from this Muscovite. We lived even shittier life. Agree completely. Free did not mean quality. Born in Moscow in 1982. My both parents had PhDs and we lived in one room apartment. We slept on couches so that it was double use. I didn't have my own space. I remember 5 hours lines and there was nothing in the stores. People were always hostile and rude to each other because it meant survival. Some people lived better. My grandparents had a 3-room apartment because they were older, but still it was pretty dilapidated compared to the US standards. We had an old car called Moskvik. Some people lived better, but they either bribed someone. I was angry at my parents that they refused to, or were in the gov, or just knew someone. There was a lot of corruption and red tape and you couldn't own your own property, you couldn't buy a house. You had to find someone who is willing to trade homes with you. My grandparents were from Odessa, Ukraine, and when they wanted to move to Moscow to be close to us, they found someone who would want their great apartment in Odessa in exchange for their awful panel apt in the Moscow. I forgot to add that my parents wouldn't get paid for months and lived on IOUs from work. My mom worked as a biologist in an institute that developed Cold War bioweapons and dealt with anthrax, Ebola, etc. At some point people were getting paid in coupons instead of money. Sugar, bread, tobacco, vodka, flour, butter. My mom worked as a biologist in an institute that developed Cold War bioweapons and dealt with anthrax, Ebola, etc. That's horrifying. My parents were born in 58 and 60, so they lived the Brezhnev years and the Gorbachev years. They always mention that it was the best during Brezhnev times. The 90s is what screwed a lot of people over, and that's why so many people clamored for the Soviet times. The stability of Soviet Union is what is mostly missed. Svetlana Alexievich, 2015 Nobel Prize in Literature, also author of the book that inspired the famous Chernobyl miniseries, has a book in which she gathers the opinions of dozens of Russians or ex-Soviet citizens about the collapse of the USSR. I think the English title is Second-Hand Time, The Last of the Soviets. It's a very interesting and objective reading. It's composed of the declarations she gets, simply transcribed and meshed together. 100% recommended if you want to dig more into the 90s in ex-Soviet territories. My mom was born in USSR and lived there until early 90s. In school they were taught propaganda and she told me she pitied Americans because there were homeless people and a lot of people not being able to afford to live. Of course there were a lot of bad things. She told me how she navigated society, like having to for several hours to get food with no guarantee of knowing what there would be, and society being very corrupt. People would steal anything, even window wipers on cars. She told me that she had 2 of her closest friends murdered, and one who passed away by an overdose. To this day I'd say that she has a socialist way of thinking. She feels strongly about welfare, opportunity, and often reminds me that had I been born in a place like the US, I would never have had all the opportunities I've had so far. The other day she told me a lot of people criticize Putin, but why do people vote for him? Why do you think he is so supported by the older generation? It is because they remember starving and freezing to death when the Germans were here. There were no cats or dogs in all of St. Petersburg. People ate everything, even wallpaper and leather belts. They remember the stores being half empty, with no foreign luxuries, no such a thing as pizza or McDonald's. They remember neighbors turning each other in, being able to trust no one. They remember the gangs taking over Russia, how it went from fistfights to gunfights and drugs. They remember, and compared to that, Putin has the country under control. People get their salary, the pension money are raised, healthcare is free, people can travel and study. In Hungary, which was part of the Eastern Bloc, many old people think communism and socialism was much better than the current system and feel nostalgic about it. Part of this can be that the 60s and the 70s were more like a soft dictatorship than hardcore communism. The other reason is that they were young at that time, so that's where the nostalgia comes from. They often say life was easier and simpler for them as everyone had a stable job that secured a basic lifestyle. They also say people were much kinder to each other back then, but who knows? Hungary was much better off than USSR, and many people traveled there to get clothes and other necessities. My grandma would go there for work and bring back stuff I've never even heard of. Just presented this question to my in-laws. For context, they've lived their entire lives in the same village in Belgorod Oblast, very close to the Russian border with Ukraine. Their area grows sunflowers for oil. Father was a truck driver, now retired. Mother was, and still is, a teacher at the local school. They're simple people. My fiance's words, not mine. Straight away they both said everything was better. If you think about it, capitalism is so fast-paced. Everyone's hunting for the next thing. Upskilling, promotions, fleshing out their resume. If you're ambitious, it's great. If you're not, you often find yourself in a competition you don't want to be in. They're in the latter category. Neither is ideologically socialist, even though they still vote for the Communist Party. They just saw it as a far more relaxed time, where you always had a secure job, a roof over your head, and something to eat. They also miss the communal aspects, as in everyone knew their neighbors and people looked after each other, I suspect out of necessity. Bear in mind, living in the countryside in the more prosperous European part of Russia meant that they would have probably had better living conditions, in some ways, than people cramped into 30 SQM Khrushchevki in the cities. That said, their village wasn't connected to paved roads until the 70s, and they didn't have electricity or running water as children. Also, one of the trademarks of Russian villages that I've noticed is yellow overground piping that runs at about head height and connects the houses to gas. They literally went decades of their lives in one of the coldest countries on earth with only wood burners, and only got connected to gas decades after their house was built. Another thing you notice about that generation is dentistry. My Western grandparents had 1 or 2 gold crowns. It was like the USSR was a full generation behind on dentistry, because people my parents' age seem to have mouths just full of shiny metal, which seems a lot more crudely done than the more subtle ones my grandparents have. Though I'm not Russian, I lived on Russia about 20 years ago for a few years. People would often say it used to be better. Taxi drivers would say capitalism was bad because if they accidentally get into a crash with the car in front of them, then their life is pretty much fricked. Under Soviet times, they would do their job and they would get their salary no matter what. Even if there was a closure or an accident, they know they're not going to lose their apartment or starve. One Russia friend that I met and chatted with pretty often was a professor earlier in life, but moved out to a tiny town and lived on his dacha. He loved political conversations, but said he used to always check the kitchen window to make sure the neighbors weren't too close when he would talk about more controversial topics. He hated Soviet times and would say things like a former slave will always give their freedom back for bread. Interesting guy. Then young kids, it was mixed. There was lots of frick the West mentality and the whole punk fight the man mindset in Russia would be anti-capitalist man and not anti-Russian govt. Many of them had no clue about politics but would rage and say they should bring back communism. I didn't really have many deep discussions with them though, so I didn't ever learn more than their basic service level commentary. The businessmen I met with loved the modern era because they were making big time money. One guy I knew worked in oil and basically talked about how his bosses could do anything they wanted, like murder people. He also was connected to sketchy people and gave me his card and told me if I needed to get out of the country or if other people were bothering me I could call him. Last comment would be about old people. They really struggled. They used to have basic incomes and their pensions in capitalist times were pennies. Most could barely afford bread to stay alive. They hadn't exactly saved up for retirement through their lives. I felt really bad for them. Old ladies would spend most of their times just walking around looking for bottles to recycle for spare money. Russian here. From what I've heard from my old folks, in USSR it was hard to live, but easy to survive. Government covered all of your basics, but you didn't have a lot of opportunities to do stuff you like. Everyone missed free housing and free healthcare. My grandma thinks doctors were better back then because they actually cared, but now they only work for disgustingly low salary. Oh, and the moral superiority is a major factor. Communism is like for the strong-willed, intelligent people. Big capitalism is for stupid little goddamn savages. In short, 90s got us fricked up hard, really hard. You had to be there to understand. It really would answer a lot of questions about modern Russia. Personally, I think 90s broke us. My grandma misses it. She liked the fact that she was guaranteed work and, in her words, translated, women still weren't equal, but everyone was so euphoric from being part of an empire that you could do almost anything as long as it was in the name of CCCP. You have been visited by the party pug. He just wants you to celebrate with him. Comment woohoo to celebrate with the party pug. Thanks for watching. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day you magnificent people.